The blood-crusted edges of Nora Winters' split lips stung as she shielded her eyes against the blazing Montana sun, her bruised face hidden beneath the wide brim of a borrowed hat as she stumbled down the dusty main street of Redemption Creek. It was 1878, and the promise of a new life had turned into a nightmare from which she couldn't seem to awaken. Her threadbare dress hung limply on her thin frame as she paused outside the weather-beaten general store, trying to catch her breath. 3 days of walking had left her boots worn and her spirits lower than she thought possible. The last of her coins had been spent on a stale biscuit the previous day, and hunger gnawed at her empty stomach. "Madam, you look like you could use a place to sit a while." The voice startled her, low and steady, coming from the shadows of the store's porch. Nora's heart hammered wildly in her chest as she took an instinctive step backward. Her fingers traced the outline of the small knife concealed in her pocket, the only protection she had managed to bring when she fled. A man emerged from the shadows, tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that had seen its share of sun and hardship. His eyes, a piercing blue beneath the brim of his dust-covered Stetson, widened slightly at the sight of her face, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "I don't want any trouble," Nora whispered, her voice hoarse from thirst and disuse. "None offered," he replied, keeping his distance. He gestured toward the door of what appeared to be a small cafe next to the general store. "Just thought you might appreciate some coffee. It's hot, and Mrs. Patterson makes it strong enough to wake the dead." Nora hesitated, weighing her limited options. Trust had become a luxury she could no longer afford, but exhaustion and hunger were powerful motivators. The man made no move toward her, simply waiting with a patience that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. "I have no money," she admitted finally. A faint smile crossed his face. "Wasn't asking for any." He touched the brim of his hat. "Name's Henry Blackwood. Most folks around here call me Hank. The coffee's just coffee, nothing more." Something in his steady gaze told Nora he understood more than he was letting on. She found herself nodding before she had consciously decided to accept his offer. The cafe was mercifully empty save for a round woman with gray-streaked hair who barely glanced up from the pie she was crimping as they entered. Hank led Nora to a corner table, positioning himself so that she had a clear view of both the door and the street beyond the window. "2 coffees, Mabel," he called, "and whatever you've got warm from the kitchen." "Stew's still on," the woman replied without looking up. "And there's bread." When the coffee arrived, Nora wrapped her trembling hands around the mug, savoring the warmth that seeped into her cold fingers. She took a tentative sip, the rich bitterness a shock to her parched throat. "Thank you," she managed, eyes fixed on the steaming liquid. Hank merely nodded, seemingly content with the silence that settled between them. It was a comfortable quiet, devoid of the tension that had been Nora's constant companion for months. When Mabel brought 2 bowls of stew and a plate piled with thick slices of bread, Nora's stomach growled audibly. "Eat," Hank said simply. "Food always helps a body think clearer." Nora didn't need to be told twice. She ate slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as her body reminded her how long it had been since her last proper meal. Hank ate his own portion without comment, occasionally glancing toward the street as if expecting someone. When she had finished every morsel and sopped up the last of the gravy with a piece of bread, Nora finally found the courage to meet his gaze directly. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Hank considered her question, taking his time before answering. "Seen enough in my time to know when someone's running from something they didn't deserve." His eyes flickered briefly to the fading bruise beneath her right eye. "Sometimes folks just need a moment's peace and a chance to catch their breath." Nora's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "And then what?" "And then," he said, placing a few coins on the table for their meal, "I offer a way out, if you want it." Nora stiffened. She had heard such offers before, and they always came with invisible strings that eventually became chains. Reading her expression, Hank shook his head. Not like that. I run cattle about 20 miles north of here. Got a small operation, but it's growing. My housekeeper, Mrs. Flanagan, is getting on in years and could use some help. It's honest work, fair pay, and no one would think to look for you there. You don't know anything about me, Nora said, her voice barely above a whisper. I could be running from the law for all you know. A ghost of a smile touched Hank's lips. Madam, I've known my share of outlaws. They don't typically have bruises in the shape of a man's handprint on their faces. He leaned back in his chair. Besides, Mrs. Flanagan is a better judge of character than any lawman I've ever met. If she doesn't take to you, I'll bring you back to town myself. No questions asked. Nora studied him, searching for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. All she found was a steady gaze that met hers without flinching. Why would you do this for a stranger? She asked. Hank's expression darkened momentarily. Let's just say I've seen what happens when no one offers a way out. He stood up, adjusting his hat. My wagon's out back. I'm heading home within the hour. You're welcome to join me, or you can walk out that door and we'll never speak of this again. With that, he turned and left, the bell above the cafe door tinkling softly in his wake. Nora sat frozen, her mind racing. Everything inside her screamed caution, warned her against trusting a stranger. But the alternative, continuing to run with no destination, no money, and the constant fear of being found, seemed suddenly unbearable. 20 minutes later, she found herself climbing into Hank's wagon, a small bundle of possessions clutched to her chest. He helped her up without touching her, then climbed to the driver's seat and clicked to the horses. As Redemption Creek fell away behind them, Nora watched the dusty buildings recede into the distance. She didn't know what waited ahead, but for the first time in months, the knot of fear in her chest loosened ever so slightly. The journey to Hank's ranch passed mostly in silence, broken only by his occasional comments about the landscape or warnings about the bumpy road ahead. Nora was grateful for his lack of questions, for the space he seemed to instinctively understand she needed. The Montana wilderness stretched out around them, vast and beautiful in its ruggedness. Rolling hills gave way to pine-covered mountains in the distance, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the trail. It was unlike anything Nora had known growing up in Philadelphia, and certainly different from the mining town where she had spent the last miserable year of her life. As the sun began to set, a small valley opened up before them. Nestled against the backdrop of a forested hillside sat a modest but well-maintained ranch house, smoke curling from its chimney. Several outbuildings dotted the property, and in the distance, Nora could make out the shapes of cattle grazing in fenced pastures. It's not much, Hank said, breaking the long silence. But it's peaceful. It's beautiful, Nora replied honestly, taking in the scene before her. After the cramped, dirty confines of a mining town, the open space and clean air felt like luxury beyond measure. As they approached the house, a stout woman with iron-gray hair emerged onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her weathered face creased into a frown as she spotted Nora beside Hank. "Mrs. Flanagan," Hank called as he brought the wagon to a stop. "I've brought someone who might be able to help you with the house." The older woman's sharp eyes took in Nora's appearance, lingering on her bruised face and threadbare dress. Something in her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "About time," she said gruffly. "I've been telling you for months. I can't manage it all myself anymore." She turned to Nora. "Can you cook, girl?" Nora straightened her shoulders. "Yes, madam, and sew and clean as well." Mrs. Flanagan nodded. "Well, come inside then. Supper's nearly ready, and you look like you could use a decent meal and a proper wash." Hank helped unload Nora's meager belongings and carried them into the house. The interior was simple but comfortable, polished wooden floors, sturdy furniture, and a large stone fireplace that dominated the main room. The smell of cooking food made Nora's stomach rumble despite the meal she'd had in town. "You'll sleep in the small room off the kitchen," Mrs. Flanagan informed her. "Used to be mine before my joints got too bad for the stairs. Mr. Blackwood's room is upstairs, along with the hands' quarters, though they mostly stay in the bunkhouse." She showed Nora to a small but clean room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. "There's water heating on the stove. I'll have one of the boys bring it in so you can wash up before supper." Left alone, Nora sat on the edge of the bed, scarcely able to believe the turn her fortunes had taken. Just that morning, she had been trudging along a dusty road, half-starved and terrified, with no destination in mind beyond away. Now she had a roof over her head and the promise of honest work. She was still sitting there when a knock came at the door. A young ranch hand, barely out of his teens, stood with a steaming bucket of water, his eyes carefully averted from her face. "Mrs. Flanagan sent this, madam," he mumbled, setting it down by the washstand. "Supper's in half an hour." After he left, Nora stripped off her filthy dress and washed away the dust and grime of the road. The warm water stung her various cuts and bruises, but left her feeling more human than she had in weeks. She changed into her only other dress, faded but clean, and did her best to smooth her tangled hair. When she emerged, she found Hank and Mrs. Flanagan already seated at the large kitchen table, along with 3 ranch hands who looked up curiously as she entered. Their gazes quickly dropped to their plates at a sharp look from Mrs. Flanagan. "Sit, child," the older woman ordered, pointing to an empty chair beside Hank. "Men, this is Miss Winters," Nora supplied. "Nora Winters." "Miss Winters will be helping me with the house," Mrs. Flanagan continued. "You'll treat her with the same respect you show me, or you'll answer to Mr. Blackwood." The men nodded their understanding, and Nora was grateful for the older woman's no-nonsense approach. No questions about her past or the state of her face, just simple acceptance of her presence. Supper was a hearty affair: roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread that put the cafe's meal to shame. Nora ate sparingly, conscious of her shrunken stomach and the eyes occasionally glancing her way. The conversation flowed around her, mostly about ranch business and plans for the following day. When the meal was finished, the hands thanked Mrs. Flanagan and filed out to return to the bunkhouse. Hank lingered, nursing a cup of coffee as Nora helped clear the table. "Leave those," Mrs. Flanagan told her when she began to wash the dishes. "You've had a long day. We'll start fresh in the morning." Nora nodded gratefully. Exhaustion was settling into her bones, the events of the day catching up with her. "Thank you," she said, looking between Mrs. Flanagan and Hank, "for everything." "Get some rest," Hank replied. "Tomorrow's soon enough to sort out the details." In her small room, Nora lay on the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling and the distant lowing of cattle. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps she had found not just a temporary refuge, but a genuine way out of the nightmare her life had become. Morning came with the crowing of a rooster and the smell of coffee brewing. Nora woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, where Mrs. Flanagan was already preparing breakfast. "Good, you're up," the older woman said without preamble. "There's coffee in the pot. Biscuits need turning in the oven, and the bacon wants watching." Nora set to work without complaint, falling into the familiar rhythm of kitchen tasks. By the time the men came in for breakfast, she had helped prepare a substantial meal of biscuits, bacon, eggs, and fried potatoes. Hank nodded a greeting as he entered, his hair still damp from washing. "Morning, Miss Winters. Sleep well?" "Yes, thank you," she replied, surprised to find it was true. Despite the strangeness of her surroundings, she had slept more soundly than she had in months. Breakfast passed quickly, the men eager to begin their day's work. As they filed out, Hank lingered again. Mrs. Flanagan will show you the workings of the house, he told Nora. Your pay will be $10 a month, with room and board provided. If that's agreeable? It was more than fair, especially considering her desperate circumstances, and Nora nodded quickly. Very agreeable, Mr. Blackwood. Hank, he corrected. Only the hands call me Mr. Blackwood, and even they only do it when there's trouble. He put on his hat. I'll be out with the herd today. Should be back by supper. After he left, Mrs. Flanagan gave Nora a comprehensive tour of the house and its workings where linens were stored, how the stove could be temperamental on damp days, which floorboards creaked and needed avoiding when the men were sleeping late after a long drive. Mr. Blackwood runs a respectable house, she said firmly as they folded sheets together. He's a good man, fair and honest, doesn't drink to excess or raise his hand in anger. Nora recognized the statement for what it was, both reassurance and assessment. I've noticed, she replied simply. Mrs. Flanagan nodded, seemingly satisfied. Well then, let's get these beds made. The men may not care if they sleep in the same sheets for a month. But I won't have it said that Blackwood Ranch is run slovenly. The day passed in a flurry of housework. Nora welcomed the physical labor, finding comfort in the routine tasks that required her concentration but allowed her mind some peace. By late afternoon, she had helped clean the entire downstairs, churned butter, and begun preparations for supper. You're a good worker, Mrs. Flanagan commented as they peeled potatoes together. Quick to learn and not afraid to get your hands dirty. That'll serve you well here. I'm grateful for the opportunity, Nora replied honestly. The older woman's eyes softened. We all need a fresh start sometimes, child. Whatever drove you here, and I'm not asking, it's behind you now. Nora felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them away quickly. Thank you, she whispered. The days that followed fell into a predictable pattern. Nora rose early to help with breakfast, spent the daylight hours tending to household chores, and assisted with supper preparations in the evening. Gradually, as Mrs. Flanagan's confidence in her abilities grew, she was given more responsibility. Hank was often gone from dawn until dusk, working with the cattle or riding the boundaries of his property. When he was present at meals, he was unfailingly polite, but maintained a careful distance that Nora appreciated. There were no probing questions, no demands for her story, just a quiet acceptance of her presence that allowed her bruises, both visible and invisible, to begin healing. A week after her arrival, Nora was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw Hank riding in, leading a second horse, a gentle-looking bay mare with a white blaze down her face. He dismounted near where she stood, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. Miss Winters. Mr. Blackwood, she replied, though she had begun thinking of him as Hank in her mind. You're back early today. Had business in town? He gestured to the mare. Thought you might like to have a way to get around the property. Walking everywhere takes time you could use for other things. Nora stared at the horse in surprise. She's for me to use? She's gentle as they come. Name's Daisy. Hank patted the mare's neck. Do you ride? It's been years, Nora admitted. My father taught me as a girl, but it'll come back to you, he assured her. Thought we might go for a short ride after supper if you're amenable. Show you a bit more of the ranch. The invitation caught her off guard. In the week she'd been there, their interactions had been limited to mealtimes and brief exchanges about household matters. I'd like that, she found herself saying. That evening, after the dishes were cleaned and put away, Nora changed into her sturdier skirt and met Hank by the barn. He had already saddled both horses and was checking Daisy's girth when she approached. I brought something that might make riding easier, he said, producing a pair of split riding skirts from his saddlebag. They belonged to my sister when she visited last summer. Might be a bit long, but better than trying to manage with what you have? Nora accepted the garment gratefully. You have a sister? Younger by 2 years. Lives in Denver with her husband and their children. He looked away as she stepped behind a stall partition to change. She visits when she can, but it's a long journey. When Nora emerged in the riding skirts, Hank helped her mount without comment, though she caught a flicker of approval in his eyes at her easy seat in the saddle. Her muscles remembered the old patterns more readily than she had expected, and soon they were riding side by side away from the ranch buildings. The evening was beautiful, the setting sun painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and pink. Hank led her along a well-worn trail that followed a small creek, pointing out landmarks and boundaries as they rode. "Creek never runs dry, even in the hottest summers," he told her. "That's what made this land worth having. Water's everything out here." They crested a small rise, and Hank reined in his horse. Below them stretched the full expanse of his ranch, the pastures with their grazing cattle, the house and outbuildings now small in the distance, and beyond them, the vast wilderness that seemed to stretch forever. "It's breathtaking," Nora said softly. "It is that." Hank's voice held a quiet pride. "Worked 5 years as a hand on other men's ranches before I could afford this place. It was nothing but a tumble-down cabin and a few hundred acres back then. Built it up piece by piece." "You've accomplished something remarkable," Nora told him sincerely. He shrugged, seemingly embarrassed by the praise. "Just worked hard and got lucky with the weather and cattle prices." He glanced at her. "How are you settling in? Mrs. Flanagan treating you well?" "She's been very kind," Nora assured him. "The work is exactly what I needed." She hesitated, then added, "I've been meaning to thank you properly for what you did. Taking in a stranger, offering work." "No need for thanks." Hank's eyes met hers briefly. "We've all got our stories, Miss Winters, some happier than others. Doesn't mean the unhappy ones can't find better endings." The simple statement, delivered without dramatics, touched something deep inside Nora. For the first time, she felt a tentative connection with this quiet man who had offered help without demands. They rode in companionable silence for a while, watching as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "We should head back," Hank said eventually. "Gets dark quick out here, and the trail can be tricky." On the ride back, Nora found herself studying Hank's profile in the fading light. He was not conventionally handsome, his nose had been broken at some point, and weather had carved lines around his eyes and mouth. But there was something compelling about his face. Strength, certainly, but also a kindness that showed in the way he handled his horse, and in the patience with which he answered her occasional questions about the land. Back at the ranch, he helped her dismount, his hands strong and steady at her waist. For a brief moment they stood close enough that Nora could smell the leather and pine scent of him before he stepped back, respectfully. "Thank you for the ride," she said, "and for Daisy." "My pleasure, Miss Winters." He touched the brim of his hat. "Sleep well." That night, lying in her bed, Nora realized that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had spent hours without fear shadowing her thoughts. The simple pleasure of the evening ride, the beauty of the land, and Hank's undemanding company had created a pocket of peace she hadn't thought possible. The bruises on her face were fading, turning from angry purple to yellowish green. Soon they would be gone entirely, though she knew the ones on her soul would take longer to heal. But for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that healing was possible. As weeks passed, Nora found herself settling more deeply into life at Blackwood Ranch. The rhythm of the days suited her, the predictable routines, the honest work, the simple meals shared around the big kitchen table. Mrs. Flanagan's gruff manner concealed a kind heart, and the ranch hands treated her with a respectful deference that never failed to surprise her after her previous experiences. And then there was Hank. Their evening rides had become a regular occurrence, weather permitting. Sometimes they talked, Hank telling her stories of his early days as a cowboy, Nora cautiously sharing memories of her childhood in Philadelphia, and sometimes they rode in comfortable silence, simply enjoying the beauty of the Montana wilderness. She learned that he had come west as a young man, drawn by the promise of open land and the chance to build something of his own. He had worked cattle drives and ranch jobs from Texas to Montana before finding this valley and knowing it was where he wanted to stay. Never much cared for crowds, he told her one evening as they watched a family of deer drink from the creek. Out here, a man can breathe. Nora understood what he meant. After the stifling confines of her marriage, the openness of the ranch was healing in ways she hadn't anticipated. Here, there was room to think, to feel, to remember who she had been before fear became her constant companion. One afternoon in late summer, Nora was picking beans from the kitchen garden when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Looking up, she saw a cloud of dust on the road that led to town. As the riders drew closer, she counted 6 men, none of whom she recognized as ranch hands. Something about their approach too fast, too purposeful, sent a chill down her spine. She abandoned the basket of beans and hurried toward the house, her heart beginning to pound with a familiar dread. Mrs. Flanagan was in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with strong, flour-covered hands. "Riders coming," Nora said, trying to keep her voice steady. 6 of them. Not our men. The older woman wiped her hands on her apron, her expression sharpening. Might be nothing. Might be trouble. She moved to the window, peering out toward the approaching cloud of dust. "Go find Mr. Blackwood. He's in the north pasture with the men." Nora hesitated, torn between the instinct to hide and the need to warn Hank. "What about you?" "I've dealt with unwanted visitors before," Mrs. Flanagan replied grimly, moving to a cabinet and extracting a shotgun that Nora hadn't known was there. "Go, child, quick now." Nora ran to the barn, her skirts clutched in her hands. Daisy nickered a greeting as she entered, and Nora quickly threw a saddle on her back with hands that threatened to tremble but remained steady through force of will. Within minutes, she was galloping toward the north pasture, pushing Daisy harder than she ever had before. She found Hank and 3 of his hands mending a section of fence. They looked up in surprise as she approached at speed, and Hank immediately dropped his tools and moved to meet her. "Nora, what's wrong?" It was the first time he had used her given name, and despite the circumstances she felt a small thrill at the sound of it on his lips. "Riders," she gasped, reining Daisy to a stop. "6 men coming fast from town. Mrs. Flanagan sent me to find you." Hank's expression hardened. "Did you recognize any of them?" She shook her head. "I couldn't see their faces." But something didn't feel right about the way they were approaching. Without further questions, Hank turned to his men. "Mike, you and Charlie keep working. John, ride to the east pasture and get the others. Tell them to come to the house but keep their distance until I signal." He looked back at Nora. "Let's go." They rode hard back toward the ranch house, and Nora could see that the riders had already arrived. 6 horses were tied at the hitching post, and there was no sign of the men or Mrs. Flanagan. "Stay behind me," Hank instructed as they approached. "If there's trouble, you ride for the line shack we passed last week. Remember it?" Nora nodded, fear a metallic taste in her mouth. They dismounted a short distance from the house, and Hank loosened his pistol in its holster before leading the way to the porch. The front door stood open, and as they approached, Nora could hear voices from inside, a man's angry tones followed by Mrs. Flanagan's curt reply. Hank entered first, Nora close behind him. The scene in the main room froze her blood. Mrs. Flanagan stood with her back to the fireplace, shotgun still in her hands but pointed at the floor. Facing her were 5 rough-looking men, and at their center, a figure Nora had prayed never to see again. Thomas Walsh had aged in the 3 months since she'd fled. His face was more lined, his once black hair now liberally streaked with gray. But the cold fury in his eyes was exactly as she remembered it, and her body responded with an instinctive flinch before she could control it. "Well, well," Thomas said, his gaze shifting from Hank to Nora. There she is. My darling wife. Hank's posture changed subtly, but he kept his voice level. This is private property, gentlemen. Whatever business you think you have here. My business, Thomas cut in, is standing right behind you. Nora belongs to me, legally and otherwise. I've come to take her home. The lady works for me, Hank replied evenly. And from what I can see, she has no desire to leave. Thomas's laugh was ugly. The lady is my wife, and what she desires is irrelevant. The law's clear on this. A husband has the right to the return of his property, be it a horse, a cow, or a wayward wife. Nora found her voice, though it emerged as little more than a whisper. I'm not going back with you, Thomas. His eyes narrowed dangerously. You don't have a choice, Nora. Never did. He gestured to the men flanking him. I've got the sheriff's deputy here and witnesses to back my claim. You're coming home to answer for what you stole from me. I took nothing but the clothes on my back, Nora protested, her voice stronger now. You took yourself, Thomas snarled. After everything I gave you, a roof over your head, food in your belly, a respectable name, you repay me by running off like a thief in the night. Hank's voice remained calm, but Nora could see tension in the set of his shoulders. I don't know what kind of man raises his hand to a woman, but he's not welcome in my house. He addressed the man wearing a deputy's badge. Is there an actual warrant for Mrs. Walsh's arrest? The deputy shifted uncomfortably. No warrant exactly, but a husband has legal rights to his wife's company, yes, Hank interrupted. But not if he's been beating her. Those bruises she was wearing when she arrived here didn't come from falling downstairs. Thomas's face darkened with rage. What happens between a man and his wife is no one else's business. Nora, get your things. We're leaving. She's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go, Hank said, and now there was steel in his voice. Thomas took a step forward. You think you can keep another man's wife and not face consequences? I could have you arrested for what? Hank cut in. Giving honest work to a woman in need? There's no law against that, even in a territory as rough as Montana. The standoff stretched, tension crackling in the air. Nora could see Thomas's hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, a familiar precursor to violence that made her stomach clench with remembered fear. This isn't over, Thomas finally said, his voice dangerously soft. Nora is my wife, and I will have her back. He looked directly at her. Remember your vows, woman, till death do us part. The implicit threat hung in the air, and Nora fought to keep her knees from buckling. Hank moved slightly, positioning himself more fully between Nora and Thomas. I think you gentlemen have overstayed your welcome. Mrs. Flanagan, would you be so kind as to show our visitors out? The older woman stepped forward, shotgun now raised to a more purposeful position. With pleasure, Mr. Blackwood. Thomas's gaze darted between the shotgun, Hank's hand hovering near his pistol, and the window, where several of Hank's ranch hands could now be seen gathering outside. Calculation replaced some of the rage in his expression. Come on, boys, he said finally. We'll settle this another way. His eyes found Nora's one last time. I'll be seeing you soon, wife. The men filed out, Thomas last of all. When the door closed behind them, Nora's legs finally gave way, and she sank onto the nearest chair, trembling uncontrollably. He'll be back, she whispered. He never lets go of what he considers his. Hank knelt beside her chair, careful not to touch her. Nora, look at me. When she raised her eyes to his, he continued. I won't let him take you anywhere against your will. You have my word on that. You don't understand, she said, tears threatening. Thomas has connections in the mining company, with local officials. In Silver Creek, his word was law. If he wants to force me back. This isn't Silver Creek, Hank interrupted gently. And I have some connections of my own. He stood and moved to the window, watching as Thomas and his men mounted their horses. John, he called to one of his hands, ride to Judge Parker's place. Tell him we need his presence here as soon as possible. Mike, you and the others keep watch on the property boundaries. I want to know if Walsh or his men try to return. The men nodded and dispersed to their tasks, while Mrs. Flanagan bustled about, putting the shotgun away and setting a kettle to boil. Tea's what you need, she told Nora firmly. Good and strong, with plenty of sugar for the shock. When the room had cleared, Hank returned to Nora's side. I need to know everything, he said quietly. About your marriage. About why you ran. About what Walsh might do next. Can you tell me? Nora took a deep breath, steadying herself. The story had been locked inside her for so long that the prospect of sharing it was both terrifying and strangely liberating. I met Thomas in Philadelphia, she began. My father had died, leaving debts I couldn't pay. Thomas was visiting on business. He owned shares in several silver mines out west. He seemed kind at first, attentive. He offered marriage and promised adventure in a new land. She laughed bitterly. What he didn't mention was his temper, or his drinking, or how isolated Silver Creek would be. Hank listened without interruption as she described the gradual descent of her marriage, how Thomas's charming facade had cracked within weeks of their arrival in Montana territory, how his occasional harsh words had escalated to shoves, then slaps, then beatings that left her bedridden for days. The last time, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, he broke 2 of my ribs because I'd spoken to the general store owner for too long, said I was shaming him in front of the town. Her hands twisted in her lap. While he was away on business, I took what little money I'd managed to hide and ran. I walked for days before I reached Redemption Creek. And then I found you. Hank finished softly when she trailed off. Nora nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. What Walsh did, what he's still trying to do, is wrong, Hank said, his voice gentle but firm. A marriage license doesn't give a man the right to treat a woman like property or to harm her. The law says differently, Nora pointed out. Then the law's wrong. Hank's response was immediate and unapologetic. Judge Parker will help us. He's a fair man who believes in justice more than technicalities. Mrs. Flanagan returned with tea, setting a steaming cup in front of Nora. Drink that, child, then you should rest. Mr. Blackwood and I will handle things for now. Nora wanted to protest that she wasn't tired, but the shock of seeing Thomas again had drained her completely. She sipped the tea, letting its warmth seep into her cold hands, and tried to believe in Hank's quiet confidence. Judge Samuel Parker arrived the following morning, a tall, imposing figure with a shock of white hair and piercing gray eyes. Hank met him on the porch, and Nora watched through the window as they engaged in a serious conversation, Hank's hands gesturing occasionally to emphasize a point. When they entered the house, the judge removed his hat and bowed slightly to Nora. Mrs. Walsh, I presume? Hank has told me something of your situation. Please, call me Miss Winters, Nora replied, lifting her chin. I no longer wish to be associated with Thomas Walsh in any way. The judge nodded thoughtfully. May I sit? We have much to discuss. Over coffee provided by Mrs. Flanagan, Judge Parker listened as Nora recounted her story again, this time including details she had been too embarrassed to share with Hank, the public humiliations, the way Thomas had controlled every aspect of her life, the threats he had made against her family back east if she ever tried to leave. You understand, the judge said when she had finished, that under current law, a husband has significant rights over his wife. Divorce is difficult to obtain, particularly on grounds of cruelty alone. Nora's heart sank, but she maintained her composure. I understand, but I will not return to him. I would rather... She didn't complete the thought, but the implication was clear. Judge Parker sighed heavily. I don't condone what your husband has done, Miss Winters. No man worthy of the name treats a woman as you've been treated. He steepled his fingers thoughtfully. There may be a way to protect you legally, at least until more permanent arrangements can be made. What way? Hank asked, speaking for the first time since the judge had begun questioning Nora. A writ of protection, Parker replied. Not commonly used in cases like this, but I've issued them before when circumstances warranted. It would legally prevent Walsh from approaching you or removing you from your current residence against your will. Hope flickered in Nora's chest. And he would have to obey it? If he doesn't, he faces arrest and imprisonment, the judge confirmed. It's not a permanent solution, but it would give us time to explore other options, perhaps evidence of his misdeeds that could support a divorce petition. Hank leaned forward. Would such a writ prevent her from working, from living her life as she chooses? Not at all, Judge Parker assured them. It simply creates a legal barrier between her and Walsh, nothing more. Then I would be very grateful for such protection, Your Honor, Nora said. The judge nodded and extracted paper, pen, and ink from his saddlebag. I'll draw it up now. Hank, I'll need 2 of your men to witness my signature. He began to write, his pen scratching across the paper in a flowing script. I should warn you both, Walsh struck me as a man unlikely to be deterred by legal niceties alone. He may well try other means to achieve his ends. We'll be ready, Hank replied grimly. By midday, the writ was completed, signed, and witnessed. Judge Parker handed it to Nora with a solemn expression. Keep this with you at all times. I'll file a copy in my office and inform the sheriff's office of its existence. After the judge departed, Nora sat at the kitchen table, staring at the document that represented her first tangible protection against Thomas. It seemed simultaneously too fragile and enormously powerful, mere paper and ink, standing between her and the man who had made her life a living hell. It will hold, Hank said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Parker's respected throughout the territory. Even Walsh won't want to cross him openly. Nora looked up at him, studying the strong lines of his face, the quiet confidence in his blue eyes. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. He shook his head. You don't need to thank me for basic decency, Nora. In my experience, she replied, basic decency is rare enough to merit gratitude when found. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, a connection that transcended words. Hank reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers briefly in a gesture of solidarity that felt more intimate than any touch she had experienced in years. You're safe here, he told her, for as long as you want to stay. The days that followed were marked by heightened vigilance around the ranch. Hank assigned men to patrol the boundaries, and no one rode out alone. Nora carried the writ of protection in a small pouch at her waist, though its presence was more reassuring than she had expected. Life gradually returned to its normal rhythms. Nora continued her work alongside Mrs. Flanagan, finding comfort in the ordinary tasks of running the household. Her evening rides with Hank resumed, though now they stayed closer to the ranch buildings and he made sure they were always within sight of at least one of his hands. As summer gave way to early autumn, Nora found herself watching Hank, when he wasn't aware the way he spoke kindly to even the youngest, most inexperienced ranch hand. How he always made sure Mrs. Flanagan had help with heavy tasks, the gentle way he handled the horses and cattle in his care. She began to recognize the warm feeling that blossomed in her chest when he smiled at her, or when their hands accidentally brushed while passing dishes at supper. It was a feeling she had thought herself incapable of after Thomas, this tentative, fragile attraction that was so different from the desperate gratitude of those first days. But she tamped it down, convinced that Hank saw her only as someone in need of protection, a responsibility he had taken on out of decency rather than any personal interest. One crisp September evening, Nora was in the kitchen preparing preserves from the last of the summer berries when Hank appeared in the doorway. He looked tired, his clothing dusty from a day spent moving cattle to their winter pastures. "Something smells good," he commented, removing his hat. Nora smiled. "Blackberry preserves, Mrs. Flanagan's recipe." She gestured to a small plate on the table. "I saved you some biscuits from supper. They're still warm." He accepted the offering gratefully, sitting at the table and watching as she stirred the bubbling pot of berries. "You've settled in well here," he observed. "Mrs. Flanagan says you've taken to ranch life as if you were born to it." "I've come to love it," Nora admitted. "The openness, the honesty of the work, the changing seasons." She hesitated, then added softly, "The people." Hank's eyes met hers, something unspoken passing between them. "Nora, I—" Whatever he had been about to say was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching at speed. Both of them tensed, memories of Thomas's last visit still fresh. Hank moved to the window, his hand dropping instinctively to his pistol. "It's Charlie," he said, relief evident in his voice as he recognized one of his hands. "Riding hard, though." He strode to the door, Nora close behind him. Charlie reined his horse to a sliding stop in front of the porch, the animal's flanks heaving with exertion. "Mr. Blackwood," he gasped, "fire in the north pasture. Looks deliberate. Someone set it right where the wind would drive it toward the winter feed." Hank's expression hardened. "Walsh," he muttered. Then, more loudly, "Round up every man, Charlie. Get word to the neighboring ranches, too. We'll need all the help we can get." He turned to Nora, his face grim. "Stay in the house with Mrs. Flanagan. Keep the doors locked and the shotgun handy." "Let me help," Nora protested. "I can ride out with you. Help fight the fire." "No." Hank's tone brooked no argument. "If this is Walsh's doing, the fire may be a distraction to get me away from the house, away from you." He gripped her shoulders briefly. "Please, Nora. Stay here where I know you're safe." The urgency in his voice silenced her objections. She nodded, and Hank squeezed her shoulders once before running toward the stable to saddle his horse. Within minutes, the ranch erupted into organized chaos as men gathered tools, filled water barrels, and mounted horses. Nora watched from the porch as Hank led them out, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach, not just for the ranch and its livelihood, but for the man who had become so central to her sense of safety and happiness. Mrs. Flanagan joined her, shotgun in hand. "Come inside, child. No use standing out here worrying." The hours that followed were some of the longest of Nora's life. She and Mrs. Flanagan took turns watching from the windows, straining to see any sign of the fire or the men fighting it. From the north, an ominous orange glow lit the night sky, and the smell of smoke gradually permeated the house despite the closed windows. "Walsh is a devil," Mrs. Flanagan muttered as they waited. "To destroy a man's livelihood out of spite." "It's not spite," Nora replied quietly. "It's control. Thomas can't bear to lose what he considers his property, whether it's land, cattle, or a wife." The older woman's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Blackwood won't let him win, child. Not this battle, nor the larger one." Near midnight they heard riders approaching. Both women tensed until Mrs. Flanagan, peering through the window, relaxed slightly. "It's our men," she confirmed. Nora rushed to the door, flinging it open as Hank dismounted stiffly from his horse. His face and clothes were streaked with soot, and exhaustion lined every movement as he climbed the porch steps. "The fire?" Nora asked anxiously. "Contained," he replied, his voice hoarse from smoke. "Lost about 20 acres of good grazing land and some of the winter hay, but the men from the Circle T Ranch helped us build a fire break before it could spread further." "Thank God," Mrs. Flanagan breathed. "Any injured?" "Mike got a nasty burn on his arm, and a couple of the others have minor burns and smoke in their lungs. Nothing life-threatening." Hank's expression darkened. Found evidence it was set deliberately coal oil trails leading from several starting points. Thomas, Nora whispered, guilt washing over her. This is my fault. If I hadn't come here, don't. Hank cut her off firmly. This is Walsh's doing, not yours. You're not responsible for his actions. Mrs. Flanagan bustled forward. You need food and rest, Mr. Blackwood. And a good washing. I've kept stew warm on the stove, and there's hot water for washing. Thank you, Mrs. Flanagan. Hank's eyes never left Nora's face. Would you mind seeing to the men in the bunkhouse? Make sure they get something to eat and tend to any injuries? The older woman nodded, clearly understanding his unspoken request for privacy. Of course. I'll take the medical supplies and some food over right away. When she had gone, Hank sank heavily onto a chair at the kitchen table. Nora poured him coffee and ladled stew into a bowl, setting both before him. Eat, she urged. You need your strength. He complied. Though his movements were mechanical, his mind clearly elsewhere. When he had finished, Nora brought a basin of warm water and clean cloths to the table. Let me, she said softly, beginning to wash the soot from his face and hands. He submitted to her ministrations without protest, his eyes closing briefly as her gentle touch soothed away some of the tension in his features. Walsh was there, he said abruptly, eyes opening to meet hers. I saw him watching from the ridgeline as we fought the fire, just sitting his horse, observing what he'd done. Nora's hands stilled. Did he see you? Yes. Hank's jaw tightened. He tipped his hat, as casual as if we'd met on a Sunday stroll, then rode away. What does he want? Nora whispered, though she feared she already knew the answer. To show that he can hurt what matters to me, Hank replied, his voice low and intense, to prove that a piece of paper won't stop him from getting what he wants. His hand caught hers where it rested against his cheek. Nora, I need to know, are you certain you want to stay here? I could arrange safe passage to Denver, to my sister's home. Walsh wouldn't find you there. The suggestion hit her like a physical blow. You want me to leave? God, no, Hank said with unexpected vehemence. That's the last thing I want. But I need to know you're safe. And as long as Walsh is fixated on this ranch, on me. On you? Nora interrupted, confused. Thomas's quarrel is with me, not you. Hank's laugh held no humor. Walsh made it clear when he watched that fire burn that this is about more than reclaiming a runaway wife. His hand tightened slightly around hers. He's seen something that threatens him more than your escape ever did. What do you mean? He's seen how I look at you, Hank said simply, and he knows what it means. The words hung in the air between them, charged with implications that Nora hardly dared examine. How do you look at me? She asked, her voice barely audible. Hank's eyes held hers, all pretense gone. Like a man who's found something he thought he'd never have, like a man who wakes each morning grateful to hear your voice in his kitchen and who falls asleep thinking of your smile. His thumb traced a gentle path across her knuckles. Like a man who's falling in love, Nora. Deeply and completely. The confession stole her breath. For months, she had harbored her own growing feelings, convinced they could never be returned, that her damaged past made her unworthy of such regard. You can't, she whispered. I'm still legally bound to another man. I'm broken, Hank. The things Thomas did don't define you, he finished firmly. What Walsh did speaks to his character, not yours. His free hand rose to her cheek, feather light and giving her every opportunity to pull away. You are the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. And if you tell me right now that you don't share my feelings, I'll never speak of them again. We'll go on as before, and I'll still do everything in my power to keep you safe. Tears filled Nora's eyes, blurring her vision. And if I do share them? She asked, her voice breaking. What then? Thomas will never grant me a divorce. He'll never let me go. Then we fight, Hank said simply. Together. For as long as it takes. His fingers brushed a tear from her cheek. I'm a patient man, Nora Winters. I can wait. The tenderness in his touch, the certainty in his voice, broke something open inside her, not a further wound, but the beginning of healing. Nora leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. I do share them, she admitted softly. I've been afraid to acknowledge it, even to myself. Afraid that wanting happiness was tempting fate. Hank's hand cradled the back of her head gently. You deserve happiness, Nora. More than anyone I know. In that quiet kitchen, with the smell of smoke still clinging to their clothes and the threat of Thomas Walsh hanging over them, Nora allowed herself to believe him, to trust in the possibility of a future where love wasn't accompanied by fear, where strength was shared rather than used as a weapon. When Hank's lips finally met hers, it was a kiss unlike any she had known, gentle but not hesitant, respectful of her boundaries, yet full of honest desire. Nora found herself responding with a passion she had thought long dead, her hands rising to frame his face as the kiss deepened. They broke apart eventually, both breathless. Hank rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if memorizing the moment. Whatever comes next, he promised, we face it together. For the first time since she had fled Silver Creek with nothing but the clothes on her back and bruises on her face, Nora felt not just safe, but truly hopeful about what tomorrow might bring. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the scent of wood smoke still hanging in the air, a reminder of the previous night's fire. Nora rose early, her mind replaying the conversation with Hank, the feel of his lips on hers, the promises they had made to each other. In the kitchen, she found Mrs. Flanagan already at work, kneading dough with more vigor than usual. The older woman looked up as Nora entered, her shrewd eyes taking in Nora's expression. Well, she said without preamble, it's about time. Nora felt heat rise to her cheeks. I don't know what you mean. Mrs. Flanagan snorted. Child, I may be old, but I'm not blind. You and Mr. Blackwood have been dancing around each other for months. Her expression softened slightly. He's a good man. The best I know. And you deserve some happiness after what you've been through. Before Nora could respond, the door opened and Hank entered, his expression grave, despite the smile that touched his lips when he saw her. Morning, he said, accepting the cup of coffee Mrs. Flanagan pressed into his hands. We need to talk about what happens next. They gathered around the kitchen table, Hank, Nora, Mrs. Flanagan, and Mike, Hank's foreman, whose bandaged arm bore testament to the previous night's fire. Walsh has made his intentions clear, Hank began without preamble. He won't be satisfied until he's either reclaimed Nora or destroyed everything I've built here. What are our options? Mike asked, his young face serious. We could fight, Hank replied. Defend the ranch, keep Nora safe behind locked doors and armed men. But that's no kind of life for anyone. He looked at Nora. And sooner or later, Walsh would find a way through our defenses. We could take the fight to him, Mike suggested. Ride into Silver Creek, confront him on his own ground. Hank shook his head. That's his territory. The law there is in his pocket. From what Nora has told us, we'd be at a disadvantage. What about Judge Parker? Mrs. Flanagan asked. Surely there's more he can do. I sent a message to him last night after the fire, Hank confirmed, but legal remedies take time, and Walsh has shown he won't respect the law if it stands in his way. Nora had been silent, listening to the discussion with growing unease. Now she spoke, her voice quiet but determined. There's another option. I could leave, go far away, perhaps to California, or even back east. If Thomas can't find me, he'll have no reason to continue targeting the ranch. No. Hank's response was immediate and firm. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. Running isn't the answer. Walsh would still blame me for your escape, And he'd still try to exact revenge. Besides, his voice softened. I just found you, Nora. I'm not willing to lose you now. The simple declaration, made in front of his most trusted employees, brought tears to Nora's eyes. The depth of his commitment not just to her safety, but to her happiness, to their future together, was still almost too much to comprehend after years of Thomas's cruelty. Then what do we do? She asked. We find a permanent solution, Hank replied. One that frees you legally from Walsh and ensures he can never threaten you or this ranch again. Mike leaned forward. I've heard rumors about Walsh for years. They say he's not just cruel to his wife, that he's involved in claim jumping, extortion, maybe even murder up in the mining country. If we could prove it. Hank nodded slowly. That's the kind of evidence that could force a divorce, no matter how reluctant the courts might be. He looked at Nora. Do you know anything about his business dealings? Anything that seemed suspicious? Nora frowned, thinking back to her time in Silver Creek. He was always careful around me, but there were late-night meetings, men coming and going at odd hours. Once I found papers in his office maps with markings that didn't match the official property lines. That could be evidence of claim jumping, Mike said eagerly. It's not enough, Hank cautioned. We need proof that would stand up in court. Something concrete enough that even Walsh's connections couldn't make it disappear. Mrs. Flanagan cleared her throat. My sister's boy works for the land office in Helena. If anyone would know about disputed claims or irregularities in Walsh's holdings, it would be someone there. Hank's expression lightened slightly. That's a start. Mike, I want you to ride to Helena as soon as your arm's up to it. Take the letter I'll write to Mrs. Flanagan's nephew and see what he can tell you. What about in the meantime? Nora asked. Thomas won't just wait quietly while we gather evidence. No, he won't, Hank agreed grimly, which is why we need to be prepared for his next move. Double the guards on the property, Mrs. Flanagan. No one comes or goes without being identified. Mike, before you leave for Helena, make sure every man is armed and knows what Walsh looks like. The meeting broke up, each person moving to their assigned tasks with a renewed sense of purpose. Nora found herself alone with Hank in the kitchen, the others having departed to begin preparations. You think this will work? She asked quietly. Finding evidence against Thomas? Hank's expression was sober. I think it's our best chance. Walsh has operated with impunity for years because no one has been willing to stand against him. But he's made enemies, Nora. And enemies talk, especially when they see someone else taking a stand. I'm afraid, she admitted, the confession difficult after months of trying to be strong. Not just for myself, but for you, for everyone here. Thomas is dangerous when he's thwarted. Hank stepped closer, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Fear's natural, but don't let it make decisions for you. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. You're not alone anymore, Nora. And Walsh is about to discover that you never were as powerless as he wanted you to believe. The kiss they shared was briefer than the previous nights, but no less meaningful a promise, a commitment to the future they both now dared to envision. The next 2 weeks passed in a state of heightened vigilance. The ranch operated as normally as possible, cattle still needed tending. Repairs from the fire had to be completed, and daily chores couldn't be neglected, but there was an undercurrent of tension that affected everyone. Mike departed for Helena, his injured arm still in a sling, but his determination undiminished. Hank divided his time between overseeing ranch operations and strengthening their defenses, reinforcing doors, positioning men strategically around the property, and establishing a system of signals in case of trouble. Nora continued her work alongside Mrs. Flanagan, finding that the routine tasks helped keep worry at bay. In the evenings, she and Hank would often sit together on the porch, watching the sunset and talking of small things, memories of childhood, favorite books, dreams they had harbored before life took unexpected turns. These quiet moments became precious to Nora. a foundation for the deeper relationship that was growing between them. Hank was unfailingly patient, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, always attuned to her comfort and boundaries. "Tell me about Philadelphia," he said one evening as they sat side by side, a respectable distance between them that nonetheless felt intimate. "What did you love most about living there?" Nora smiled, remembering. "The libraries. My father was a teacher, and he believed education was the greatest gift he could give me. We would spend hours in the public library together, exploring worlds through books." "You miss it?" Hank asked. "The libraries, yes. The city." She considered. "Not as much as I expected to. There's something about this land, the openness of it, that feels more like home than Philadelphia ever did." "Even with all the hardship you've faced here?" Nora turned to look at him, her expression softening. "The hardship came from one man's cruelty, not from Montana itself." Her hand found his between their chairs. "And it was here I found kindness again, when I needed it most." Hank's fingers tightened around hers. "When this is over," he said quietly, "when you're truly free, what do you want most, Nora?" The question caught her off guard. For so long, her only desire had been escape, survival. The luxury of wanting more had seemed unattainable. "Peace," she said finally. "A life without fear. Work that matters. And—" She hesitated, then continued with newfound courage. "Someone to share it all with. Someone kind and strong and gentle." Her eyes met his. "Someone like you, Hank." The look that passed between them needed no words to interpret. In another life, another time, he might have pulled her into his arms then, sealed their understanding with a kiss. But both were acutely aware of her still married status, of the propriety that needed to be maintained until her situation was resolved. Instead, Hank raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with a reverence that moved her more deeply than any passionate embrace could have. "That's what we're fighting for," he told her. "And we will win, Nora. I promise you that." Mike returned from Helena a week later, his expression grim but triumphant as he sought out Hank and Nora in the barn where they had been tending to a sick foal. "I found something," he announced without preamble. "Walsh has been falsifying claim documents for years. Mrs. Flanagan's nephew showed me the records. There are at least a dozen properties around Silver Creek where the boundaries have been altered after filing, always in Walsh's favor." Hank straightened, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Can we prove it's his doing?" "Better than that," Mike replied, producing a folded document from his coat. "I found a former clerk from the land office who admitted Walsh paid him to make the changes. He's signed a statement to that effect, had it witnessed by Judge Parker himself." Hope surged in Nora's chest. "Is it enough?" "For criminal charges, probably," Mike said. "For a divorce." He hesitated. "Judge Parker thinks it strengthens your case considerably, but he's still researching precedents. Proving Walsh is a criminal helps, but divorce laws are complicated when it comes to wives separating from husbands." "It's a start," Hank said, his expression determined. "And it gives us leverage. Walsh won't want these allegations made public. They could ruin his standing in Silver Creek, maybe even send him to prison." Nora's mind raced with possibilities. If Thomas thought I had evidence against him, he might agree to a divorce just to keep it quiet. "It's risky," Hank cautioned. "If we threaten him with exposure but don't have enough to make the charges stick, we'll only make him more dangerous." "I know Thomas," Nora insisted. "His reputation means everything to him. It's why he was so enraged when I left, not because he cared for me, but because of how it reflected on him." She met Hank's concerned gaze steadily. "This could work, Hank. It could be the way out we've been searching for." Before he could respond, the sound of a dinner bell rang urgently from the direction of the house, the signal they had established for trouble. All three of them tensed, exchanging alarmed glances. "Stay here," Hank ordered Nora, already moving toward the barn door with Mike close behind him. "No," she countered, following them. "If it's Thomas, I should be there. He's less likely to start shooting if he sees me." Hank looked as if he wanted to argue but recognized the logic in her words. "Stay behind me," he said finally. "And if I tell you to run, you run. No questions." They hurried toward the house, Hank's hand resting on his pistol, Mike flanking Nora protectively. As they approached, they saw Mrs. Flanagan on the porch, shotgun in hand, facing a group of riders in the yard. Thomas sat at the center of the group, looking smugly confident. Beside him was the deputy who had accompanied him on his previous visit, and behind them, 4 rough-looking men whose hands hovered near their weapons. "Blackwood," Thomas called as they approached. "I've come to conclude our business." Hank positioned himself in front of Nora, his stance casual but ready. "What business would that be, Walsh?" "You know very well." Thomas's gaze shifted to Nora, his eyes cold. "I've been patient, given my wife time to come to her senses. That patience has run out." "I have a writ of protection," Nora called from behind Hank. "Judge Parker himself signed it. You can't force me to go anywhere." Thomas smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Circumstances have changed, my dear. Deputy Miller here has a warrant for your arrest." The deputy shifted uncomfortably in his saddle but produced an official-looking document. "Warrant for the arrest of Nora Walsh on charges of theft and abandonment of marital duties." "Theft?" Nora exclaimed, indignant. "I took nothing but my own clothes." "You took a family heirloom," Thomas countered smoothly. "My grandmother's gold locket, worth quite a substantial sum." "That's a lie," Nora said, her voice shaking with anger. "I never touched your grandmother's locket. You know that." Thomas shrugged. "The magistrate in Silver Creek believes otherwise. The warrant is legal and binding, Nora. You're coming back to face the charges." Hank's voice remained steady, though Nora could see the tension in his shoulders. "That warrant has no jurisdiction here. Judge Parker would need to approve its enforcement in this county." "Which is why I visited the judge this morning," Thomas replied, his smile widening. "He was most understanding once I explained the situation." Nora felt a chill run through her. "You're lying. Judge Parker knows what kind of man you are." "Judge Parker knows the law," Thomas corrected. "And the law says a wife can't steal from her husband, then run away without consequences." He gestured to the deputy. "Show them the judge's endorsement." The deputy extended the warrant and Hank took it, his expression darkening as he read. "This isn't Parker's signature," he said flatly. "I know his hand. This is a forgery." Thomas's smile faltered slightly. "Careful, Blackwood. Accusing an officer of the law of carrying false documents is a serious matter." "So is forgery," Mike interjected, stepping forward. "And claim jumping, and bribing government officials, all of which we have evidence you've been doing for years, Walsh." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Thomas's eyes. "What nonsense is this?" Hank seized the opening. "We know about the altered boundary markers, Walsh, the falsified documents at the land office. The clerk you paid off has signed a confession naming you directly." Color drained from Thomas's face, quickly replaced by an angry flush. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Hank countered. "Judge Parker has the evidence now. He's probably drawing up charges as we speak." The deputy glanced at Thomas, confusion evident in his expression. "Mr. Walsh? What's he talking about?" "Nothing but lies," Thomas snapped. "Blackwood is desperate to keep my wife, so he's inventing stories." "Not inventing," Nora said, stepping out from behind Hank despite his attempt to keep her shielded. "Thomas, I saw the maps in your office. I heard the late-night conversations about adjusted boundaries and relocated stakes. I didn't understand then what it meant, but I do now." Thomas's hand moved toward his gun, his face contorted with rage. "You always were too clever for your own good, Nora." Hank's gun cleared its holster in a smooth motion, aimed steadily at Thomas's chest. "Don't," he warned quietly. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. The deputy looked between Thomas and Hank, clearly uncertain whose side he should take. The hired men behind Thomas tensed, hands hovering near their weapons. It was Mrs. Flanagan who broke the standoff, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Riders coming," she announced. "Looks like Judge Parker himself with several men." All eyes turned toward the road, where a cloud of dust announced the approach of multiple horses. Thomas's expression shifted from rage to calculation, then to a cold determination that Nora recognized all too well. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Not by a long shot." He wheeled his horse around. "Come on, boys. We're leaving." The deputy hesitated. "Mr. Walsh, the warrant." "Forget the damn warrant," Thomas snarled. "We'll come back with more men." Before anyone could stop them, Thomas and his companions spurred their horses and galloped away, taking a different route than the approaching riders. Nora sagged with relief, and Hank was immediately at her side, his arm supporting her. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though her legs felt unsteady. "He'll be back," she whispered. "With more men, just like he said." "Let him come," Hank replied grimly. "Next time, we'll be ready." Judge Parker arrived minutes later, accompanied by 4 armed men wearing marshal's badges. His expression was grave as Hank explained what had just transpired. "Walsh is growing desperate," the judge observed. "That's good and bad news. Good because desperate men make mistakes. Bad because they're also at their most dangerous." "What do we do now?" Nora asked. "We accelerate our plans," Parker replied. "The evidence your man found in Helena is compelling, Mrs. Walsh, but not yet enough for an arrest warrant. However, combined with this attempt to use a forged document bearing my signature," he shook his head in disgust, "that gives us grounds to move against him more aggressively." Hank stepped forward. "What about Nora's situation? The divorce?" The judge sighed heavily. "That remains complicated. The courts are reluctant to dissolve a marriage, even with evidence of criminal activity by the husband." He looked at Nora sympathetically. "But there may be another approach. If Walsh were to be arrested and convicted of serious crimes, his rights as a husband would be significantly curtailed. You might petition for a divorce on grounds of his incarceration." It wasn't the clean break Nora had hoped for, but it offered a path forward. "How do we get him arrested?" she asked. "He won't come quietly, and Silver Creek is practically his personal kingdom." "We draw him out," one of the marshals suggested. "Away from his territory, somewhere we can take him without his local support." Judge Parker nodded slowly. "It could work, but we would need bait he couldn't resist." All eyes turned to Nora, and she felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. "Me," she said quietly. "I'm the bait." "Absolutely not," Hank said immediately, his expression hardening. "We're not using Nora to lure Walsh into a trap. It's too dangerous." "I agree," Judge Parker added to Nora's surprise. "Mrs. Walsh has suffered enough at that man's hands. We'll find another way." But Nora's mind was already racing ahead, seeing the possibilities. "What if it wasn't actually me?" she asked slowly. "What if Thomas just thought it was?" Hank looked at her sharply. "What are you suggesting?" "A rumor," Nora explained, the plan forming as she spoke. "That I've gone to Redemption Creek to meet with a lawyer about divorce proceedings. Thomas would hear about it through his network of informants. He'd come after me, but I wouldn't actually be there." The marshal who had suggested drawing Walsh out nodded appreciatively. "It could work. We set up our men in town, wait for Walsh to arrive looking for her, and arrest him when he tries to interfere with what he believes is a legal proceeding," Judge Parker finished, "on multiple charges: the forgery, the claim jumping, and attempted coercion." Hank still looked deeply unhappy with the plan. "There are too many ways it could go wrong. Walsh is cunning, and he's likely to bring men with him." Which is why we'll have plenty of our own men in place, the marshal assured him, and why Mrs. Walsh will be safely hidden away, nowhere near Redemption Creek. Judge Parker considered the plan carefully. It has merit, he admitted finally. And it may be our best chance to catch Walsh in the act of something clearly illegal, with multiple witnesses. I want to do this, Nora said firmly, meeting Hank's concerned gaze. It's time Thomas faced consequences for his actions, and it's the clearest path to freedom. Hank's expression remained troubled, but he recognized the determination in her eyes. If we do this, he said slowly, we do it with every possible precaution, and I stay with Nora the entire time, wherever she's hidden. Agreed, Judge Parker said. We'll need a few days to position our men and spread the rumor convincingly. In the meantime, Mrs. Walsh should remain here under guard. The details were hammered out over the next hour how the rumor would be spread, where Nora would actually be during the operation, and how they would communicate once Walsh took the bait. By the time Judge Parker and the marshals departed, night had fallen, and the ranch was quiet save for the increased number of guards patrolling its boundaries. Nora stood on the porch with Hank, watching the riders disappear down the road, a mixture of hope and trepidation churning in her stomach. Are you sure about this? Hank asked quietly. There's still time to find another way. She turned to him, studying the strong lines of his face in the lantern light. I'm sure. For the first time since I met Thomas, I feel like I have some control over what happens next. She reached for his hand, finding comfort in his steady warmth. And I have something worth fighting for now. Hank's fingers tightened around hers. When this is over, he promised, when you're free, we'll build something good here, Nora. Something that's ours. The promise hung in the air between them, a vision of a future that suddenly seemed possible, a life without fear, filled instead with work and purpose and love. It was worth any risk, Nora decided. Worth facing Thomas one last time, even if only from a distance, to finally break the chains that bound her to her past. 3 days later, the plan was set in motion. The rumor began circulating in Redemption Creek that Nora Walsh had been seen entering the office of a visiting lawyer from Helena, supposedly to discuss divorce proceedings. Judge Parker's men, disguised as ordinary townspeople, took up positions throughout the small town, waiting for Thomas to take the bait. Nora, meanwhile, was securely hidden at a small hunting cabin belonging to Judge Parker, located in a densely wooded area about 5 miles from Hank's ranch. The cabin was sturdy and well supplied, with a clear view of the approach trail and natural barriers on 3 sides. Hank had insisted on staying with her, posting 2 of his most trusted hands as additional guards in the surrounding woods. They had arrived before dawn, taking a circuitous route to avoid being followed, and now they waited for word that Thomas had appeared in Redemption Creek. The hours passed slowly. Nora tried to occupy herself with small tasks tending the fire, preparing a simple meal from the supplies they had brought, mending a tear in one of Hank's shirts. But her mind kept returning to Thomas, to the confrontation that would hopefully lead to his arrest and, eventually, her freedom. You're thinking too hard, Hank observed from where he sat cleaning his rifle by the window. I can practically hear the gears turning. Nora smiled despite her tension. Just wondering what happens after. If this works, if Thomas is arrested. When? Hank corrected gently. When he's arrested. And after that, we take one day at a time. The legal proceedings will likely be lengthy, but Judge Parker will ensure they're fair. And us? Nora asked, the question that had been hovering in her heart finally finding voice. What happens with us, Hank? He set the rifle aside and crossed to where she sat, kneeling before her chair so their eyes were level. Whatever you want to happen, he said simply. I meant what I said before. I'm a patient man. If you need time after you're free, time to find yourself without Walsh's shadow hanging over you, I'll understand. The tenderness in his expression nearly undid her. This man who had offered coffee and silence, and a way out when she had nothing, who had stood against Thomas without hesitation, who looked at her now as if she were something precious, he was offering her yet another gift, the freedom to choose her own path, even if that path didn't immediately include him. "What if I don't want to wait?" she asked softly. "What if I already know what I want?" Hank's eyes darkened with emotion. "Then as soon as you're legally able, I'll be asking you a very important question. Nora Winters." The promise in his words wrapped around her heart like a warm blanket. Nora leaned forward, bridging the small distance between them to press her lips to his in a kiss that held all the hope and longing she had kept carefully contained. They were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, a single rider, coming fast. Hank was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, positioning himself between Nora and the door. "Get behind the table," he instructed quietly. "Use it as cover if needed." Nora complied, her heart racing as she crouched behind the heavy oak table. The rider drew closer, then stopped outside the cabin. There was a brief exchange of passwords with the guards hidden in the woods, then a knock at the door. "Mr. Blackwood? It's Charlie, I've got news." Hank opened the door cautiously, relaxing when he confirmed it was indeed his ranch hand. "What's happened?" Charlie removed his hat, nodding respectfully to Nora as she emerged from behind the table. "Walsh took the bait," he reported. "Rode into Redemption Creek about an hour ago with 6 men. The marshals were waiting, just like they planned." "And?" Hank prompted when Charlie hesitated. "There was shooting," the young man admitted. "Walsh wouldn't surrender. Tried to fight his way out when he realized it was a trap." Nora's hand flew to her mouth. "Was anyone hurt?" Charlie nodded grimly. 2 of Walsh's men were killed. One marshal took a bullet in the shoulder. And Walsh himself. "Is he dead?" Nora asked, a complex mixture of emotions churning inside her at the possibility. "No, madam. Wounded, though took a bullet in the leg when he tried to escape. They've got him locked up in the Redemption Creek jail under guard. Judge Parker sent me to tell you it's safe to return to the ranch now." Relief washed over Nora, not just that Thomas was captured, but that he was alive. She had never wished for his death, only for her freedom from his control. "Thank you, Charlie," Hank said, clapping the young man on the shoulder. "Ride back and tell Judge Parker we'll be along shortly." After Charlie departed, Hank turned to Nora, studying her face carefully. "How are you feeling?" "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "Relieved, certainly, but also strange. Thomas has been such a shadow over my life for so long, to know he's locked away, that he can't reach me anymore." She shook her head, struggling to articulate the complex emotions swirling within her. "It will take time to fully believe it," Hank said gently, "to trust that he's really gone from your life." "Will he be?" Nora asked, doubt creeping in. "The charges might not stick, or he could be released on bail." "Judge Parker won't let that happen," Hank assured her. "From what Mike found, the claim-jumping charges alone are serious enough to keep Walsh locked up until trial. And attempted murder of a federal marshal?" He shook his head. "Walsh has finally overplayed his hand." They gathered their belongings and rode back to the ranch, accompanied by the guards who had been watching the cabin. As they crested the final hill and saw the ranch buildings spread out before them, Nora felt a sense of homecoming unlike anything she had experienced before. This place, which had begun as simply a refuge from danger, had become something far more significant. It was where she had found her strength again, where she had learned that kindness could exist without ulterior motives, where she had dared to envision a future that included love and partnership rather than fear and subservience. Judge Parker was waiting for them at the ranch house, his expression weary but satisfied. He confirmed Charlie's report and added details. Thomas was under heavy guard, his wound painful but not life-threatening. The evidence against him was substantial, and more was emerging as people in Silver Creek, emboldened by his arrest, came forward with their own stories of his misdeeds. "What happens now?" Nora asked when he had finished his explanation. "He'll be moved to Helena for trial once his wound allows," the judge replied. "Given the seriousness of the charges and the evidence we've gathered, I expect he'll be convicted and sentenced to a significant prison term." And my marriage? The question that had dominated Nora's thoughts for months now seemed almost secondary to Thomas's fate. Yet it remained the final barrier between her past and her future. Judge Parker's expression softened. "I've been researching that very question, Miss Winters. There is precedent for divorces granted when a husband is convicted of serious crimes, especially those involving violence or moral turpitude. With Walsh likely facing years in prison, I believe we can petition successfully for a dissolution of your marriage on grounds of his criminal activity and the danger he poses to you." Hope blossomed in Nora's chest. How long would such a process take? "Several months, at minimum," the judge cautioned. "Legal wheels turn slowly, especially in matters of marriage, but I will personally expedite the process as much as possible." It wasn't the immediate freedom Nora had secretly hoped for, but it was a clear path forward, one with an endpoint she could now envision. "Thank you," she said sincerely, "for everything you've done." Judge Parker smiled, the expression warming his usually stern features. "It's been my pleasure to see justice served, Miss Winters, both for the territory's sake and for yours." His gaze shifted briefly to Hank, who stood quietly at Nora's side. "I suspect I'll be called upon for another legal service before too long, once this matter is settled." The implication was clear, and Nora felt a blush rise to her cheeks even as Hank's hand found hers, twining their fingers together in silent affirmation. "I expect you will, Your Honor," Hank replied, a rare smile lighting his features, "and will be honored to have you perform that service when the time comes." The months that followed were a study in patience. Thomas's trial proceeded as Judge Parker had predicted, with a steady stream of witnesses testifying to his various crimes. The evidence Mike had uncovered about the altered land claims proved crucial, as did testimony from several of Thomas's former business associates who, seeing him finally vulnerable, were eager to save themselves by providing details of his illegal activities. Nora was called to testify about the abuse she had suffered, a harrowing experience that nonetheless proved cathartic. Facing Thomas across the courtroom, she spoke clearly and confidently about the beatings, the control, the fear that had defined their marriage. His cold glare, once so terrifying, now seemed pathetic, the impotent rage of a man who had lost his power over her. Hank was there each day, a steady presence in the back of the courtroom, his support unwavering through the difficult proceedings. In the evenings, they would return to the ranch together, where life continued its seasonal rhythms: cattle to tend, crops to harvest, repairs to complete before winter set in. These ordinary tasks grounded Nora, reminding her that while the legal battle with Thomas was important, it was not the sum of her existence. Here, at Blackwood Ranch, she had built a life worth living, one filled with honest work, genuine friendships, and a love that grew deeper with each passing day. When the verdict finally came, it was decisive. Thomas Walsh was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud, claim jumping, assault, and attempted murder of a federal officer. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in the territorial prison, with the possibility of additional charges still pending. As Thomas was led away in chains, he looked back once at Nora, his expression a mixture of hatred and disbelief. She met his gaze steadily, refusing to flinch or look away. It was the final confrontation between them, not a word spoken, but volumes communicated in that exchange of glances. The divorce proceedings took longer, as Judge Parker had warned. Legal arguments were made, precedents cited, religious objections raised and addressed. Through it all, Nora maintained her determination, supported by Hank's unwavering presence and the judge's skilled advocacy. On a crisp spring morning, nearly a year after she had first stumbled into Redemption Creek with bruises on her face, Nora sat in Judge Parker's office as he handed her the final decree. "It's done," he said simply. "You are legally Nora Winters once more, free of any marital obligations to Thomas Walsh." The paper trembled in her hands as she read the formal language that restored her independence. Tears blurred her vision, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming relief and joy. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for the gratitude she felt. Judge Parker smiled. "You did the hard part, my dear. You survived, you testified, you persevered. Now go live the life you've earned." Hank was waiting outside, his tall figure leaning against the hitching post, hat in hand. When she emerged from the judge's office, his eyes immediately sought hers, questioning. Nora held up the decree, a smile breaking across her face. "It's done," she echoed the judge's words. "I'm free." In 3 quick strides, Hank closed the distance between them, sweeping her into an embrace that lifted her feet from the ground. His kiss was public and unabashed, a declaration to anyone watching that this woman was cherished beyond measure. When he finally set her down, they were both breathless, oblivious to the amused glances of passers-by on the busy Helena Street. "I have something to ask you," Hank said, his voice husky with emotion. "I've been carrying it for months, waiting for this day." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. From it, he extracted a ring, a simple gold band set with a single perfect sapphire that matched the blue of his eyes. "Nora Winters," he said, kneeling before her on the dusty street without a trace of self-consciousness. "You came into my life bruised and afraid, but with more courage than anyone I've ever known. You've made my house a home, my ranch a place of joy, my life complete in ways I never imagined possible." He held up the ring, sunlight catching on the deep blue stone. "Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Nora looked down at this man, this good, honest, gentle man, who had offered coffee and silence, and a way out when she had nothing, who had fought for her freedom as fiercely as if it were his own, who now knelt before her with his heart in his hands. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes. Hank Blackwood. 1,000 times? Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and kissed her again, more gently this time but with no less feeling. Against her lips, he murmured, "Welcome home, Nora, for good this time." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Redemption Creek, the same town where they had first met. Mrs. Flanagan wept openly throughout the ceremony, while Mike and the other ranch hands stood awkwardly in their Sunday best, genuine happiness for their boss evident in their usually stoic faces. Judge Parker performed the ceremony, his judicial solemnity giving way to warm sincerity as he pronounced them husband and wife. "What began with an act of simple kindness," he said, looking between them, "has grown into something rare and precious. May your life together be as strong as the mountains that surround us and as enduring as the land you both love." The celebration afterward was joyous music and dancing in the ranch house, food and drink flowing freely, neighbors and friends gathering to wish them well. Nora, dressed in a new blue gown that Hank had insisted on buying for the occasion, moved through the crowd with a lightness she hadn't felt in years, perhaps ever. Late in the evening, as the party continued around them, Hank led her outside to the porch, where the spring night was cool and star-filled. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist, holding her close against the evening chill. Nora leaned into his embrace, looking up at the vast Montana sky. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. "When I ran from Thomas, I was only thinking of escape of what I was running from. I never imagined what I might be running toward." Hank's lips brushed her temple. Life has a way of surprising us sometimes. Indeed it does, Mr. Blackwood, she agreed, turning in his arms to face him. Who would have thought that a cup of coffee and a quiet corner table could lead to all this? His smile was tender as he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I knew the moment I saw you that you were someone worth knowing, Nora, even with the bruises. Maybe because of them, I could see your strength, your courage. I didn't feel very courageous, she admitted, just desperate. It takes courage to flee into the unknown, Hank countered, to trust a stranger when all your experience tells you not to build a new life from nothing. His hand cradled her cheek gently. You're the bravest person I know, Nora Blackwood. The new name sent a thrill through her, not because it represented belonging to another person, as her marriage to Thomas had, but because it symbolized the family they were creating together, the future they would build on foundations of mutual respect and genuine love. Inside, the music had shifted to a slower tune, the notes drifting out to where they stood. Hank offered his hand with a formal bow that made Nora laugh. May I have this dance, Mrs. Blackwood? You may indeed, Mr. Blackwood, she replied, placing her hand in his. They danced there on the porch, under the stars, swaying to the distant music. Nora rested her head against Hank's chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, and knew with absolute certainty that she had found her way home at last. 5 years later, Nora stood on that same porch, watching as Hank taught their 3-year-old son, Samuel, to ride his first pony. Their daughter, Elizabeth, just a year old, babbled happily in her arms, reaching toward her father and brother with chubby hands. The ranch had prospered under their joint stewardship. Nora's education and head for figures had complemented Hank's practical knowledge of cattle and land management, allowing them to expand their holdings and improve their breeding stock. The modest house had been enlarged to accommodate their growing family, though they had been careful to preserve its character and warmth. Mrs. Flanagan still ruled the kitchen, though now she shared those duties with a younger woman from town who came in 3 days a week. The older woman had become a beloved grandmother figure to the children, spoiling them with cookies and stories while maintaining the fiction that she was too old for such nonsense. News had reached them the previous winter that Thomas had died in prison pneumonia, according to the official report, though rumors suggested he had made enemies among his fellow inmates. Nora had received the information with a strange sense of detachment, as if hearing about the death of a distant acquaintance, rather than the man who had once dominated her life with terror. Are you all right? Hank had asked when she told him the news, his concern evident in his expression. Yes, she had replied truthfully. I made my peace with Thomas long ago. His death doesn't change anything about my life now. And it was true. The shadow Thomas had cast had faded years before, replaced by the bright reality of the life she and Hank had built together. The ranch, their children, the community they had helped strengthen, these were the substance of her days now, not the ghosts of past fears. In the pasture, Samuel gave a delighted squeal as the pony trotted in a small circle, Hank's hand steady on the lead rope. The little boy's face was alight with joy and pride, his features a perfect blend of his parents', Nora's green eyes, and Hank's determined chin. "Papa, look, I riding," he called, his grammar still charmingly imperfect. "You sure are, partner," Hank replied, his smile as bright as his son's. "Just like a real cowboy." Nora laughed, bouncing Elizabeth gently as the baby clapped her hands at the spectacle. This was happiness. She thought not the absence of trouble or the guarantee of smooth paths, but the presence of love sturdy enough to weather whatever storms might come. As if sensing her gaze, Hank looked up toward the porch, his eyes finding hers across the yard. The smile he gave her still held the same warmth, the same quiet adoration it had that first evening when he had offered coffee to a bruised stranger. I love you, he mouthed silently, the words carried on the spring breeze as clearly as if he had shouted them. And I love you, Nora whispered back, knowing he would read the shape of the words on her lips, understand the depth of feeling behind them. Samuel was clamoring to go faster, and Hank returned his attention to their son, adjusting the lead rope with the skill of a man who had spent his life working with animals. Nora watched them for a moment longer, then turned to carry Elizabeth inside for her nap. As she crossed the threshold into the home they had built together, Nora paused, struck by a memory herself on that first day, hesitating outside the cafe in Redemption Creek, weighing whether to trust the quiet cowboy who had offered her a moment's respite and a way forward. It had been the bravest decision of her life, and the best. That cup of coffee, that moment of silence in a corner booth, had been the first step on a path that led here to a life filled with purpose and joy, to a love that healed rather than harmed, to a future limited only by the horizons they chose to set for themselves. Outside, Samuel's laughter rang out again, bright and clear in the Montana sunshine. Nora smiled, closing the door behind her, secure in the knowledge that some journeys, even those that begin in darkness and fear, can lead to the most unexpected and perfect destinations.